Well, welcome everybody to the last seminar of the Center for Syrian Studies for this academic year. Today, we take the opportunity to showcase some of the recent work of our resident fellows. First part of today's presentation is current trajectory will be examined in work by two of our scholars who recently completed their PhDs. And this is our way of celebrating their achievements, and I refer specifically to Dr. Tamara Al-Om and Dr. Ferdinand Arslanian. And to them we say, Mabruk, bravo. Their two studies are extremely relevant. They open doors to understanding where Syria is poised just now. And specifically by that, I mean that the military conflict appears to be frozen, but the struggle for Syria is, of course, continuing in different ways. One struggle is the deployment of sanctions by the West, particularly the US, in an effort to prevent the Assad regime from reconstructing Syria in ways that would reward loyalists, but also I think this is aimed at leaving Russia and Iran with a failed state, a quagmire, as Jim Jeffries put it. So this struggle is currently maybe the most immediate determinant of Syria's near future. The other struggle is an ongoing contestation in Syrian civil society, particularly in the virtual communities online, and to a great extent, those are communities outside Syria. One of the unexpected consequences of the uprising is that there is a virtual Syria outside the actual Syria. And here, some Syrian agency survives, and it's also going to shape where Syria goes in the years ahead. So that's what we'll look at first. Our first presenter is Dr. Tamara Al-Om, who will speak on civil society. She just received, in the last year, I think, her PhD at St. Andrews for her study on Syrian civil society. After getting her degree, she worked on a research project on Syrian refugees. And she's now working with the Red Cross on another research project about refugees, particularly, I think, in Dundee. So she combines a scholarly command of theory of civil society with a hands-on understanding of civil society among the Syrian diaspora in particular. So welcome, Tamara, and it's over to you.
Thank you very much. I will just share my screen, if that's possible. Can you all see that? Yep, cool, excellent, perfect. I'll just move you over there so I can still see you as well. Right, so thank you all for coming today. I'm really glad to finally be here and be in a position to do this. It's actually been a while since I've revisited this work after far too many years of working on it. And I'm not sure how ready I am to be looking at it again, but here we go. So, no. There you go. So this research essentially seeks to be a pathway into understanding the civilian-led, non-violent opposition and its role in the uprising. It also attempts to highlight the importance of this role in maintaining and preserving Syrian culture, in developing and encouraging intellectual thought, and in continuing the non-violent resistance against an oppressive and despotic state, whether that's from inside of Syria or now in exile. Ultimately, the aim of this work is to emphasize the importance and relevance of the civilian-led opposition, whose 10-year struggle was recently marked globally by a return to the streets with a reiteration of their demand for dignity and freedom. It's probably a good point to clarify a little what I mean by Syria's oppositional civil society, and that's namely secular liberals. And it's important to clarify who they are in opposition to, and that is both, well, firstly, the Syrian regime, but also the nihilistic Islamist organizations, the imperialist centers, and latterly, the anti-imperialist old ideological left that has generally been a supporter of Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian regime. Finally, just to briefly say that this research also conducted some is based on some empirical research in the forms of social media observations and in semi-structured interviews that were carried out with civil society actors and organizations in Beirut and Istanbul. So to begin with, theoretical investigations, this work plays with the traveling concepts of both civil society and the intelligentsia, leading to the development of a theoretical framework that allows us to broaden our understanding of both these concepts. So to begin with, this thesis works towards an understanding of the concept of civil society, and it attempts to move it beyond its very Eurocentric origins, and in order to enable it to be able to be used and applied to alternative cultural, social, and political contexts. To do this, then, it explores the shifts that have occurred in the conceptualization of civil society in Western discourse, but also looking at the conceptualization of civil society in Arab thought as well. And the key to this is its reconceptualization of civil society that's based in 4 fundamentals. And this is particularly a civil society that's acting in a state of war. So these 4 fundamentals are basically as civil society being beyond the domain of just NGOs, and instead seeing civil society as being a source of resistance that is fundamentally political in nature and which emerges from below, from the people. It is within such a reconceptualization of civil society that it then becomes possible to consider who the primary actors of this civil society are, which leads us to the second theoretical investigation, which explored the intelligentsia. So this chapter looked at a theoretical approach for understanding the role of the intelligentsia within society. And it did this through an exploration of its complex and multidimensional relationship with both state and society. Its relationship to the state can be found to range from an intelligentsia that legitimizes and supports the state to an intelligentsia that is primarily present as opposition to that state, with a significant role in revolutions or rebellion. It also considers the roles and responsibilities of an intelligentsia within society and what that relationship is between the two. The second point it explores within this chapter is the organic intellectual, which plays a primary role within this whole thesis. And obviously coming from Gramsci, it's an important element of the research, and it points to a new social group that is created to counter the hegemonic power. As such, it is the oppositional intellectual that is the organic intellectual, and it is they who act in the interests of the subaltern group from which they emerge, that thus enabling them to influence and articulate the group's collective will. It is therefore, as a result of this, that this research is then able to consider the intelligentsia as a vital part of civil society, who act as representatives of civil society, and it therefore treats them potentially as a mouthpiece of that civil society, although of course it's much more complicated than that. So moving on to some of the more empirical investigations, it begins with a historical background and a historical overview of Syria's leftist oppositional civil society. So because of the relationship between Syria's oppositional intelligentsia and the regime being complex, of course, always imbalanced in favor of the regime, but it did sometimes fluctuate between episodes when the intelligentsia were treated as political opponents to be watched, restricted, and when needed, violently suppressed. to having periods of co-optation and rare occasions where they were granted opportunities to become involved in political activities. It was important to provide this historical background since the coming to power of the Assad regime in order to understand this specific change in the nature of the intelligentsia. And in order to do this, it looks at two overarching periods under Hafez al-Assad and under Bashar al-Assad, and how they approach civil society actors. And it looks at these particular historical periods. And then it moves on to looking at the start of the uprising and the role of intellectuals in that at that time. Moving on to the second empirical investigation, this part of the work looks at the period in which civil society was acting predominantly within Syria, right at the start of the uprising in 2011. Here, the representatives of the civil society are identified as an emerging new organic intelligentsia who are able to articulate the political voice of this oppositional civil society, resulting from the shift in the nature of Syrian civil society from one that emerged amongst the old and traditional intelligentsia to one that emerged from below, from amongst the new organic intelligentsia acting within the non-violent movements of the uprising. Therefore, rather than looking at these new players as merely an expanded intelligentsia, it identifies them as new, not just because of their wider social base, but also because of their ability to operate in areas outside of government control and surveillance, a phenomenon that was made possible by the context of widespread protest and then war. So this chapter is based on, as I said, empirical research, and this involves social media observations of individuals, groups, and organizations over a 3-year period. As such, it examines the demographics of the intelligentsia, how they come to act as representatives of civil society, and importantly, what activities they undertake to support the uprising, including in the realms of media, the arts, institution building, and governance. And paramount to this discussion is the consideration of the challenges faced by people within this realm, including around issues of identity, the role of women within the uprising, and the issue of international aid and funding. The final empirical investigation looks at a period in which civil society actors acted predominantly beyond the borders of Syria. And this chapter takes a particular focus on those who were in Istanbul and Beirut. It looks for opportunities to explore the idea of a transnational Syrian civil society that is no longer restricted by traditional geographical boundaries of the nation state, but rather one that has built networks of civil society which simultaneously inhabit different countries and cities while coalescing across these real and virtual spaces as a force of resistance. These particular findings emerged out of interviews that I carried out with civil society actors, artists, intellectuals, and certain organizations based in Istanbul and Beirut. And they revealed the emergence of new spaces of civil society in exile. They also highlight the importance of maintaining a sense of Syrian identity in their work to provide alternative narratives to the Syrian conflict that focus on rebuilding and eventual return, despite their life in a state of permanent exile. And finally, this chapter uncovers some of the struggles that people face in exile, including the impact of the continued departure of civil society's actors from the MENA region, how life is lived in a state of permanent exile, and how there's an overwhelming sense of resignation that things are unlikely to change anytime soon. And those interviews were conducted a few years ago, so the situation's probably much worse now. So just to conclude on the thesis, this research has obviously investigated the changing nature of Syrian civil society and its intelligentsia, and its continued metamorphosis remains its main feature. It has been one of the main aims of this research to illuminate to the reader that those who started out as citizen activists in the early uprising, over time and with growing experience, became the new organic intelligentsia of the revolution. They took on the roles of organizers, protectors, spokespersons, and often in their deaths, symbols of the revolution. There have been questions over whether this is a failed revolution, because it never achieved the original aims of the peaceful uprising. However, for this thesis, this is not the case. It continues to show how a new organic intelligentsia have been acting as a counter-hegemonic force of resistance by contributing to the development of civil society and its continued operation over the last 10 years in the real and virtual spaces. And we can see this if we consider where things are now. This year in March marked the 10-year anniversary of those peaceful protests, and that was responded with more protests, both in Syria and outside of it. And the elections that we recently saw as well were reciprocated with more protests, again, in Syria and outside of it. And there is this continued resistance that is present. And finally, just to note on the theoretical side of things, I have been pleased to see that my attempt at this reconceptualization of civil society is adaptable to other situations as well. And my work currently within researching the UK asylum system, I've been able to see that civil society actors are still having to play that role and fight this traditional idea that they are just NGOs and they have no political, motivation there. And it is about this slow resistance. It's about a progression of things over time that eventually lead to change. And that's where I'll end.
Thank you, Tamara.
I think that, am I still sharing? Oh, there you go. Yes, I'm still sharing. There you go.
I think we'll leave questions till after Ferdinand's presentation. But before moving on to Ferdinand, I just wonder if your examiner might want to make a comment about her experience of your work.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I think that's referring to me. Is that right, Ray? It's been such a joy to see the development of Tamara's work and her research. And I genuinely think that this is, it offers some innovative, in some places groundbreaking potential for thinking about not just Syrian civil society and contextualized within the revolution, because there's so many compartments of it. And I think what the thesis did very well is identify a very specific aspect of it, demonstrate why you weren't looking at certain other parts, the militarized parts, and why it was necessary to actually focus on the civil society, because that often gets overlooked. But also, as you said towards the end there, that it's applicable to other contexts. I think one of the key things I noticed when examining your thesis, Tamara, is that when we talk about civil society, we often think about it in a democratic context, right? By its very nature, it's something that operates and is able to find space, evolve, has agency, right, and capacity to change things in an open society, whereas your research looks at those developments within a war context, and I think that's quite original. And so I really look forward to seeing that develop in the future, and a huge congratulations on your research. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Jasmine. So next, we look at the struggle over sanctions in a presentation by Dr. Ferdinand Arslanian. Before coming to St. Andrews for his PhD, Ferdinand worked in the German Development Agency in Syria, so he has a grasp of theory as well as things on the ground. And I would say he's become perhaps the world's foremost authority on sanctions in the Syrian crisis. So welcome, Ferdinand, and over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Just one technical issue. I don't have the share file. I'm on my web browser. So I've just uploaded the presentation. Does anybody know how to share it with the rest? Like, if I open SharePoint, does anything happen?
Ferdinand, if you wanted to email it to me, I can share it.
Okay, that's good. Okay, share screen. Okay, I found the.
How's it coming, Ferdinand?
Yeah, just a second here.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Can you see my presentation?
It was there for a minute. Yep, it's back. I can see it now.
Okay. Okay, so sorry for the delay. So my main investigation is to explain how the Syrian regime copes with economic sanctions. So if we go to the sanction literature, and more specifically 2015, you have two books which discuss the effectiveness or more the ineffectiveness of economic sanctions. One was by Brian Early, which discusses the question of sanction busting from third countries. And one was by Lee Jones, which discusses the societies under siege. So if we notice that the subtitles are fairly similar, yet the main theme is completely different. So in busted sanctions, as we see from the picture, we have ships, basically, we have international actors contributing to sanction busting, while in the Lee Jones, what we see is basically ancient people fighting, more reflecting the internal dynamics within the target country. So we have, by 2015, we have a stratification of the literature on the ineffectiveness of economic sanctions between international and domestic factors. So my research is to investigate the causal process that allows a target regime to endure economic sanctions, beginning from the implementations of sanctions up till the domestic dynamics within the target country. So in terms of developing a theoretical framework, I attempt to elaborate on the mechanisms through which sanctions function at the level of the target country, while at the same time, I integrate the different international factors, the way the sanctions are being implemented, the role of third parties' response into these sanctions, into these mechanisms. And I will use the case of the US-EU sanctions on the Syrian Arab Republic as a plausibility probe to test and refine the theoretical framework. In terms of methodology, we have a single case, basically, which being examined in depth in-depth manner. And this is related or associated with the process tracing qualitative methodology, where we have an intervening variables from the cause to effect. We have various variables which are intervening in the causal process, with each variable has related to an activity and an actor. So just having a quick review of the literature, beginning with the international factors, we have the sender, so the country that implements or that imposes the sanction. So up till like basically last year, this has been an under-researched topic. The main argument here is that there's a difference between designing the legislation that imposes the sanctions and how sanctions are implemented. And this is related to the interaction between the government enforcing and the firms within the state complying, which is basically related to the capacity to monitor and the willingness to implement penalties. While we go to the third countries, here there is more systematic research, and it's divided into two main categories: sanction busting, so third countries undermining the sanctioning episode, while on the other hand, we have cooperation between with the sender, which basically third countries become secondary senders, and they join the sender country in imposing sanctions. And then we have, in between these two extreme cases, we have various forms of neutrality, whether paying lip service to cooperation with sender or not joining the sender's coalition, but passively complying or refraining from exploiting the sanctions episode. Another element within sanction busting is related to whether we have political or commercial motivations for sanction busting, and how this, whether commercial or political motivation, how it affects the type and level and the effectiveness. So the theoretical argument head forth by Brian Early from, I forgot the name of the university, the University of Albany. His grounded theory was that countries with political motivation had more interest and they were more effective in undermining sanctions, yet his empirical testing showed that it's the combination of both rather than simply political motivation. And here his theories developed more into something similar to the sender countries' arguments, where we have the government has political motivation to either undermine or comply with the sanctions, versus firms merely have commercial motivations, and the final outcome is based on the interaction between two. Moving to the more target level domestic factors, what we have mainly is the macro level versus the micro level. So the macro level is the overall economy, which is more the traditional theory, which is related to the cost hypothesis. So basically, the more cost the sanction, the target endures, the more it's likely to comply. Nevertheless, this has been contested by more disaggregated or micro level domestic mechanisms, which view it as some sort of a naive theory. And here, throughout time, there has been more elaboration of the mechanisms. So we begin with institutional theory, which simply distincts between the regime type. So authoritarian countries with small winning coalitions are more likely to endure sanctions, versus democracies with broader winning coalitions are less likely to endure sanctions. Then the mechanisms are more elaborated, where we have public choice theories or new Weberian theories, which sanctions affect different actors differently within the target country. And if the groups that are affected negatively are politically influential, then they are able to discuss with the target state to comply. So here we go more into the more sophisticated mechanisms. Then there's the inputs of power framework, where sanctions affect the authoritarian state's capacity to repress and to repress or protestations or to pay their loyalty. So the sanctions affect the state budget and at the same time the supply and the prices of political power input. So here we see a more elaborate mechanism between economic deprivation and funding the target's political co-optation and repression. We move over to Jones, where we have Gramscian social conflict analysis, which takes on the inputs power framework and gives it more structure. So here we have economic sanctions intervene in the target's contestation of state power. Here, the change in resources due to sanctions will affect the ruling group's financial the financing of their strategy to lead to another strategic response, which in turn will have political implications affecting the societal composition and will have different political repercussions for both the ruling and opposition coalitions. And here he contrasts between South Africa, where sanctions worked, versus Myanmar and Iraq, where sanctions did not work. So in the case of South Africa, we have the culmination of the different factors led to, from one side, an independent business class from the ruling regime, and from another side, an empowered opposition due to different factors. So here we have a new coalition where the business class allied with the trade union-based black opposition, and here we have the regime in South Africa had to abandon apartheid. Versus Myanmar and Iraq, where we had the business class was still under the control and co-optation of the ruling regime after the imposition of sanctions. We move over to the final framework for domestic level, which is Connolly 2018 from Birmingham. So here we have a political economic framework. So he criticizes former models for not taking the economic dimension sufficiently enough, which basically obfuscates how sanctions process. So he begins with discussing prior to the sanctions episode, the pattern of integration of the target state with the global economy, and how this is related to the domestic system of the political economy. So what's the sectoral composition of the economy? How's the public finances? What's the role of the state? So this allows us to know the rules of the game within the target state. And basically, it relinks with the arguments of Jones of how the ruling elite strategies co-opt other groups. So we have a more political economy basis to understanding the nature of the conflict and how the target country will act after the imposition of sanctions. So basically, it's remodifying the Jones framework to take more an explicit account of the economic structure. While we go to the interaction between international and domestic, here there's highly under-theorized. So there is one notion, explicit notion by Green, where he argues that sanction busting acts as the economic basis for the success of domestic rallying tactics. So he was investigating, I think, Cuba and Israel, another country, I can't remember. So here there's argument, hadn't they been provided with oil, they would never been able to have all these internal cohesion. Now, examining the implicit notions of interaction for later studies, we can reaffirm the Green's argument in a more complex way. So international factors could either mitigate the economic impact of economic sanctions and hence maintain the system of political economy. So if you have an oil ban and you used to export oil to Europe, so simply re-exporting oil to China, and you will preserve your previous system of political economy, and it will not have an impact on the target economy. A more complex way is that you have international factors assist in achieving counter strategies. So if your response to economic sanctions is to rely more on import substitution, so a third country could help you with importing the necessary material. Here you might have a modified system which could co-opt more social groups or could not, probably. And here we have a more, let's say, the Joker element, where we have third parties will contribute to the modification of the structure of the target economy, resulting in unforeseen political repercussions. And here the case of Myanmar, where its trade with Europe shifted into more trade with Asia, and to the shift in the economy to more extractive rather than labor-intensive exports to more extractive exports, and it had different political repercussions. So what I can conclude from all these arguments that we can reintegrate international factors in the same way into the whole complex process of target countries' strategic response, its resources and social composition. So we take the Jones argument of how it affects strategies of sanctions, how sanctions affect strategy, and we can simply add the international factors. So here we get a complex, not very complex, but looks complex. So here we get the framework for analysis. So we begin with three interrelated aspects of the dependent variable before imposition of sanctions. So it's basically merging Jones with Connolly. So we have the pattern of integration in the global economy is related to the domestic system of political economy, which shapes the social constitution of power. Then we have the independent variable, which is the sanction regime. So basically the imposition of the sanction, the legislation to impose sanctions. Then we have the international level, which is basically how the sender country reacts and how third countries react. And both in turn have the internal dynamics within each country, which is basically an interaction between state and non-state actors. So hence we distinguish sanctions from sanctions implementations, where the state enforces and non-state actors comply. Then we have third countries, where states have a political motivation to either to undermine or not to undermine the sanctions episodes, while non-state actors may have or not have a commercial interest. All these international level factors counteract with the counter strategies of the regime, and to a lesser extent with the strategic response of the opposition coalition and the key social groups in the economy. And hence we get a new pattern of integration of the global economy, which is interrelated with the new domestic system political economy, which reconfigures the social constitution for state power and defines the intervening role of the sanctions episode within the internal context of the sanctioned country, the sanctioned country. So we move on to discussing Syria's political economy prior to the imposition of sanctions. So Syria had a specific form of a post-populist authoritarian regime, which was transforming, it was in the continuous process of a transformation to a post-populist system. And the reason for this volatility, or for the specific case, is related to the volatility of its rent resources. So in the 70s, it relied more on political rent. By the 80s, these dried out. By the 90s, there was a resurgence in oil. And by the 2000s, that source was also dwindling. And here we get a two-stage process of liberalization or transformation into a post-populist authoritarian regime. And the second stage begins with the year 2000 up to 2010 with the assumption of Assad Jr. Bashar of the presidency. So in general, we had a twofold strategy in which from one side there was a cooptation of populist classes through various measures, including achieving agricultural self-sufficiency, a protective trade regime helping artisans and small manufacturers, subsidization of consumption, whether through a bread production system or through an overvalued exchange rate, or for free social services, and also an amplified employment system. While from the other hand, the other side of the strategy was to co-opt portions of the business class. So we have a stratified business class with different stratas of the business class having different types of privileges or political positionality. So basically your elevation as a businessman is related to your relations with the regime. And here we have the state business networks as defined by Haddad. So by the year 2000, or throughout 2000 and 2010, we have a partial reneging of the populist social contract, which will provide the basis for the rural backlash and the emergence of the populist coalition of the adversely affected. So this is not only a rural backlash, we have different business sectors have been basically sidelined from the structure. We have artisans losing from trade liberalization, and the Arab Spring represented the suitable platform for transforming this into a more active political process, basically. So looking at the sanctions regime, we have the initial phase. This is in the early, from April to August 2011. So here we have the economic impact was minimal. It was simply asset freezes on travel bans on some regime personnel and companies, more related to people in the very higher echelon of the power and people directly involved in repression. Phase 2, which is from August 2011 to October 2012, which is basically the actual starting date of the sanctions process. So here we have, it begins with a change of Western countries' stance from the Syrian crisis, when calling explicitly for Assad to leave, and it begins with the EU oil import ban. And throughout the late 2011 until 2012, we have various sanctions on the financial sector and the insurance sector. And this here, we have the projected impact becomes very severe. So the loss of oil revenue and the asset freezes affects the whole macro balances of the country, basically affecting the country's public expenditure and import capacity. And this is exacerbated by the different transaction-related constraints related to financing and insuring. And hence the sanctions, the projected impact of the sanctions is basically that the Syrian regime will fail to meet its populist commitment due to the various sanctions upheld. Moving on to the phase 3, we have a series of exemptions related to the militarization of the conflict, whether related to attempts to empowering the opposition, having a partial exemption on oil bans, or humanitarian, so the ability to use freezed assets to fund humanitarian transactions. Moving to the phase 4, we have basically begins in 2014, and basically the whole import networks that the system has developed and countering the sanctions are retargeted. So this is what's called extraterritorial sanctions, where the sender sanctions third countries or third companies, or companies from third countries. So to see how the framework applies, we distinguish between two periods. Period 1, where we have the Syrian crisis is in the process of escalation. This is the 2 years of 2011, 2012. And we have period 2, where we have complete militarization of the Syrian conflict. So this is from 2013, 2016. Then there's the other period where you have a more constrained militarization, which has not been addressed in the thesis. So to see how the different strategies or the different levels interrelate, we have the weak monitoring capacity of the Syria's regime's financial assets. Thus, the lack of enforcement of regional sanctions of the Arab League will allow the Syrian regime to retrieve all its foreign assets. So throughout the 90s and 2000s, the Syrian regime accumulated plenty of reserves amounting to around 18 billion, and it has been able to retrieve most of it. So the freeze did not work precisely. This has been countered with the failure to redirect oil exports. So there were plenty of negotiations with India to redirect the oil exports of Syria to the EU. Commercial companies were interested. Nevertheless, the Indian government did not want to provide insurance guarantees for the shipping, and hence it failed to redirect its exports. Also, Syria's allies were not very interested in whether Russia or Iran were not very interested in importing Syria's complete oil. There were some decisions, some discussions, but nothing materialized. Then we have the various transaction impeding sanctions, so things related to insurance, things related to financing, to paying. So here we notice companies suffer from the over-compliance. So given that there's sanctions, they are risk averse. So they basically stop dealing with the Syrian country, or not even like the Syrian state, or even private actors altogether. This has been compensated partially by the sanction busting from political allies and regional countries. So what we have here is the banking system of Russia and the shipping system of Iran, in addition to political motivated actors in regional countries such as Lebanon and Dubai. Here you get a complex network that allows for the continuation of imports. So based on the existence of foreign funds between the retrieved foreign assets and the ability to partially circumvent the related transaction impeding sanctions, we get a restricted ability to continue with procuring imports necessary for the economy. So to look at the overall outcome, what we see is an evaporation of revenue sources and the reliance on reserves. So here we have a disintegration of the pattern of integration in the global economy. Nevertheless, the domestic system is precariously maintained. So despite the evaporation of resources, the Syrian regime is still able to maintain its system. The business class is kept in check. Whoever is dissociated has been replaced based on the stratified system. And the regime is still providing the basic services and the basic public employment, salaries, the politics of bread and bread procurement. So in terms of the related social constitution for space power, this whole process allowed preventing a wider populist backlash. And with the opposition trying to advance to the metropolises, there has been a popular resistance as it advances. As such, the sanctions and the countermeasures allowed the Syrian regime to survive the opposition assault. And hence, by late 2012, we have a new military stalemate, and we go to a new military period. Here we have economic devastation. The production capacity of the Syrian state has undermined. At the same time, we have new sources of revenue, including Iranian credit lines. So basically, we have the Iranian bank, Sadirat Bank, provides loans which are unlikely to be repaid for allowing the Syrian state to procure imports. On the other hand, we have other third parties, such as international organizations involved in humanitarian aids, or the expatriate community through their remittances, also counselor fees, so basically renewing passport. These represent all new forms of foreign revenue sources. And also for the sake of procuring imports, we have all this regional import procurement networks which have been developed in the previous periods become more solidified. At the same time, the sanctions regime is right now put in order. So we have a very complex system with various jurisdictions, which leads to over-compliance from various companies and banks. And while the US monitoring system and enforcement system ensures that not only US companies comply, but also EU countries and companies, as well as other third countries, comply with the sanctions. So here we have, similar to the previous period, a restricted ability to procure the important imports. And this is related or interrelated with the regime's strategy or new strategy of developing an exclusivist patrimonial system where you reward loyalists and punish opponents. And in terms of populist commitments, where there's a prioritization, there's a primacy of public salaries over subsidies and social services, and in turn over support to agriculture. So the pattern of integration in the global economy, we have the emergence of new political and humanitarian rent. While the domestic system of political economy in general, we have the reconfiguration of the system. At the same time, we have a de-development, so the Syrian country has becoming poorer, fragmentation between different sovereignties. We have outsourcing of social responsibilities to basically different NGOs, which are related to the international organizations. In terms of the business class, we have the emergence of a conflict elite, which basically intervenes in the whole process, whether through circumventing sanctions or interacting with the humanitarian aid, or related to the military aspects of the conflict itself. And the populist classes are re-stratified into classes, let's say a quasi-middle class, which relies on public salaries, and other classes which are controlled by humanitarian aid. So within this context, sanctions play a peripheral role. Nevertheless, the whole system of this exclusive patrimonial system allows to disparities with non-regime areas, and hence the Syrian regime somehow wins the competitive state reformation process. So to conclude, the framework discussed has sufficient explanatory power for explaining the outcome. And in both cases, we have a narrowed maintenance of the political economy and its interrelated or embedded control mechanisms explain how the Syrian regime coped with sanctions. Few areas can be improved. The international environment is more complex, given that we have the US overarching monitoring system and the related secondary sanctions. Here we have overcompliance from non-state actors. Similarly, the interaction between international factors and target actors is more complex as well. So if we go back to, we see different successes and different failures of the sub-strategies interact all together to lead to an outcome. So these are areas to be improved in terms of the framework. So we go to where am I going with my life and how it's related to my research the implications of my research. So there's a conference in Germany where I'll be discussing basically the second period, the reconfiguration of the Syrian political economy. It's more related to the first period. There's a conference in the LSE called Gramsci in the Middle East. So here I'll be expounding on the opposition and coalition, the opposition and regime coalitions and their funding, and how sanctions affected the dynamics of both coalitions. There's an initial agreement with the center to work as a visiting scholar on the Trump administration, which I will discuss a bit later. Also, there's areas to investigate how secondary sanctions function in the case of Syria. Then we can go beyond Syria to discuss the case of Lebanon, how sanctions of Hezbollah affects the contestation for state power within Lebanon. We can also see the withdrawal of funding to Hariri also could be from Saudi Arabia could also be discussed in this context. We have Yemen, also the Houthis versus the Saudi or Emirati-backed government. Also, we have various forms of sanctions and withdrawal of humanitarian aid, which could be discussed. Similarly, we can apply it to Venezuela. So just to discuss, let's say, the incomplete third period, here we have the Trump administration.
We really don't have much time, so go
okay,
please.
So here we have maximum pressure and extraterritorial sanctions are drawn to the extreme. We have the famous Caesar law, but also we have various forms of extraterritorial economic restrictions, basically threatening others not to deal with the Syrian government. In terms of impact, we have it affects the regime's integration strategy, so reintegrating the recaptured areas, plans for reconstruction. Also, we have the traditional methods for populist cooptations has been affected. We have the triple bread, fuel, and currency crises. Also, it implies that the spheres of influence is basically dividing Syria into different areas with regional influences has been consolidated as regime is no longer a viable alternative. And just the final side, what can be investigated in that period, we have how did the sanctions affect the internal conflict, elite conflict? Does the sanctions explain the Makhlouf versus the First Lady struggle for power? Do we have a principal agent problem here, where the constraint of resources needs that the principal has to take power from the agent? How does the enforcement of extraterritorial sanctions function, whether it's deterrence? So basically, you simply have the legislation and third parties simply refrain from dealing with the Syrian regime, or there's something more to it? And how do political allies react? Basically, from one side, they have an increasing political motivation to bust sanctions versus an undermined capacity to do so. Okay, so thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Ferdinand. I don't know if any of your examiners want to make a point about their experience of your work. Okay, well, they may have had to go. Okay, well, we'll move on then to our final presenter. That's Dr. Omar Emadi, who will talk about his forthcoming work on past trajectories in Syria, which help us to understand the current one. For me, this is a bittersweet occasion because Omar is stepping away after many years as Deputy Director of the Syrian Study Center to pursue other opportunities in publishing. Before turning over to him, I do just want to say a few words about how important Omar was to the center. He joined the center as a senior resident fellow in 2012, so he's been with us a decade. In 2013-14, he became Deputy Director for Outreach. His remit was to raise the public profile of the center, to deepen the dissemination of its research, and he did it in a spectacularly successful. In concrete terms, he began extensive engagement with the media. He designed the website. He launched our online journal, Syria Studies, and served as its editor for many years. But in addition, Omar led the partnership of the center in various collaborative research projects, particularly with the UN Economic and Social Commission of West Asia, which produced two important volumes called Syria at War. And also, Omar was instrumental in arranging a consultation contract with the World Bank on reconstruction. So how will we replace him? I don't see how we can. But still, let's wish him well in his new ventures, which he's now going to talk about. First, well, he'll talk about two projects. One, the unauthorized biography of a Damascene reformer, which is an exploration of Syria's recent history through the prism of the experience of Dr. Muhammad Emadi, who is a former Syrian economy minister for many years. And also there's a second project, When Her Hand Moves, a collection of novellas. So over to you, Omar.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you for your kind words. Maybe a bit of context. Those of you who know me know that I basically work in two realms concurrently, fiction and Syria. And a few months ago, a massive, unexpected door or opportunity opened up in the realm of fiction. And it all coincided with the presidential elections in Syria as well, which somehow in my mind, perhaps somewhat unconsciously, I had placed as the last possible date for me to expect in some type of optimistic fashion, something to change in Syria. Perhaps something that would allow me to visit my parents who are in their late 80s, early 90s, finally. And perhaps even provide me with an opportunity to do something for Syria. But as you all know, this did not take place. And meanwhile, this very generous offer that I received in the realm of fiction opened up. And I decided that perhaps all of this means that being a Sufi at heart, I look for signs. And to me, this was a sign that it was time for me to depart. Also, during this time, there has been this, what I call my second PhD thesis, which is a book about my father that, like all PhD theses, had this deadline extended and often stalled, and I didn't want to work on it. Then it would come back, not only because it entailed so much research, but also because of the many both academic and personal issues it involved. For those of you who may not know, Muhammad Imadi, my father, is a very interesting person. Objectively speaking, he defies a lot of the expected equations so far as how Syria worked under Assad. And that in itself was the first thing that drew me into this project, but also because I'm not my father. I have a very strong idealist side to me that often had trouble with the fact that my father was part of the Syrian regime. So in a sense, this was a cathartic exercise. I wanted to write this story. I wanted to understand it, but I also wanted to look for a way to come to terms with it. And so the unauthorized biography of the Messianic reformer, because my father himself has written what amounts to his own version of his memoirs, which in my mind is highly censored, with no personal dimensions, and written for a very specific audience. So he never encouraged me to write the book I have just completed and submitted. Waiting now for the first reviews. But I knew I had to write it. And I basically go through my father's life. My father was born in 1930. In 1955, he was sent as part of a very large number of Syrians. There was a man named Abdul Wahab Hamad, who was the Minister of Finance at the time, and he was sponsoring a lot of scholarships. And my father was one of them, and he was sent to NYU to study economics. And he was sent just to get his master's, but he finished that very quickly and he applied for a PhD. And he finished his PhD in economics from NYU in 1960. Of course, also in the United States, in New York, he meets the very first month he arrives, my mother, a New Yorker student with strong leftist tendencies, was studying at NYU at the time English literature, and they meet and they get married in 8 months. So they returned together to Damascus in 1960. In 1960, my father was expected to serve for 8 years to pay back his scholarship. So he joins the Ministry of Planning at the time. And so here he is, 1960, 1963, he's working under the UAR, right? The United Arab Republic. And then, of course, 58 to 61. So only for 1 year he's working under AR. Then 61 to 63, he's working under the secessionist regime, right? And then 63, of course, is the Ba'ath coup. And then we have, of course, more than one Ba'ath. So we have the first Ba'ath, 63 to 66. And then we have the second, 66 to 72. And all throughout, he's at the Minister of Planning. In 68, he becomes the Deputy Minister of Planning. And then in 69, something very strange takes place, which is that various generals at the time were basically receiving a special degree from the Soviet Union in military sciences. And they wanted someone to teach them a course in economics. And it chose my father. So my father was, in essence, in 1969, teaching Hafez Assad, Tlass, Najib Jamil, and many others. Perhaps Abdullah's father, if he's with us, he can confirm it. But around 15 generals. And so in a sense, he was Assad's tutor for a while. And Assad was peculiar and strange, as we all know he was in the sense that he wouldn't ask any questions in the presence of others. And he would arrange for private, basically tutoring sessions with my father. So he can ask the questions he would not otherwise ask. So this event, which my father didn't really think much of, because in 1970 he has applied to the UN, and my mother was finally relieved. She's leaving Damascus. They're going to go and have their dream job, was the FAO at the time, Rome, Italy, something like that. And then, of course, the coup takes place. And my father gets instructions not to leave Syria. And of course, he immediately assumes that he had done something really terrible. But then it was Assad's plan that he would place him in his first cabinet, and he would keep him as a minister from the time he became a president to 1979. He would reluctantly authorize his departure to Kuwait to become the president of the Arab Economic and Social Development Fund for 5 years, 6 years. And in 85, he brings him back almost by force from a very comfortable job in Kuwait to Syria, where he is a minister from 85 to 2000. President dies. He continues to be a minister of economy until the first cabinet change under Bashar. But that doesn't even end the story, because in 2006, he reappears as the head of the Syria stock market, and he continues in this job until 2014. So it's a long career. He's finally retired. He's 91. He's, of course, still in Damascus. All my mother's dreams of leaving the country were shattered way back in 1970. And what do you do with all of this? So on one hand, my book documents all of this, because here we have a window into various phases of Syria's history. But throughout, I interject the narrative by my own thoughts on what is taking place, by my, let's say, external, possibly idealist understanding of what should have taken place. And what I want to do is basically share with you the way in which I end this. And I end this by resorting to a debate by someone that you may have heard of, whose name is David Lubin, who is a professor of law and philosophy at Georgetown University. And Lubin wrote this controversial work entitled Complicity and Lesser Evils. And he focuses basically on two lawyers who worked under the Nazi regime. And in his mind, their presence can be shown to have tangibly and directly saved lives. But on the other hand, their mere presence within this regime inevitably facilitated various other types of events and activities, and that the regime, the Nazi regime, was involved in. And Lubin is trying to understand at what point is the line crossed? At one point, is it no longer feasible to explain your presence within a regime of this type? And in trying to come to terms with this, he reaches out to a term that he denotes as Spielraum, which is the German word for what we might call oppositional maneuverability. It's a capacity to maneuver yourself within a context that has enough contradictions within it to give you a space, a scope to do something that you would otherwise not be able to do. And in Lubin's mind, as long as this scope for maneuvering exists, then it is possible to explain the presence of someone within a regime of this type. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, we, and this was in essence, his article initiated a debate. We have a professor named Helen Ardent, who is also a professor of law, who basically disagreed very significantly with Lubin. And she basically saw that any type of attempt to work within a regime of this type is to very quickly lose sight of why one entered to begin with. And she eloquently describes that one enters under the guise of a lesser evil, only to find him or herself as an integral part of manufacturing this evil. And to bring the point closer to home, I focus on the experience of Hjalmar Schacht, who was the Minister of Economy under Hitler, and who in fact ends up in a concentration camp during the Nazi period because he, in the final analysis, was not seen as loyal enough, was seen as too argumentative and not quite as pure as a Nazi as the Nazi regime expected him to be. Nevertheless, Robert Jackson, who was basically appointed by President Truman in 1945 as chief counsel in the Nuremberg trials, he goes after Schacht in an unexpected fashion. And I quote, "It was Schacht, the facade of starched respectability, who in the early days provided the window dressing, the bait for the hesitant, and whose wizardry later made it possible for Hitler to finance the colossal rearmament program and to do it secretly." And he goes on, "It is doubtful whether the Nazi master plan could have succeeded without the specialized intelligence of figures like Schacht, who willingly put it under its command. They did so with knowledge of its announced aims and method, and continued their services, and after practice had confirmed the direction in which they were trending." Yes, and there's more. But the point here is that this, in essence, provides us with the map through which the experiences of not just Dr. Muhammad Ahmadi, but many other what I call Damascene reformers, not necessarily because they're all from Damascus, but people who basically followed a philosophy of working within a regime they did not identify with morally, under the heading of working for their country. And in their mind, as Lubin identifies, there was enough room for maneuvering for them to be able at any given moment to advance, however minimally, the types of meaningful changes and reforms they were trying to enact. And yet, and this is why, in essence, the very objective I was after, which is trying to come to terms with all of this, wasn't a final analysis. It was more left as an open question. One has to come to grip with the idea that it is precisely the presence of intelligent, morally upright, honest, hardworking people within regimes of this type that can act as a confusing factor for those not quite sure on how to interact with regimes of this type, because it gives it's almost like a screensaver that can lure, as it often has, many people into signing these unwritten agreements with the regime, and to proceed to work within it. So this, in essence, is this book. Like I said, it's basically two books that account, as my father would have shared it, but at the same time, it's interjected by all these introspections that most of which were written after 2011. And in the final analysis, I did not come to terms with this legacy. I just, perhaps I understood it more, but maybe the reader will, and I think maybe that's a fit-in ending. It's basically allows the reader to arrive at his or her conclusion. So this was the unauthorized biography of an Argentine reformer. As far as the novellas Ray alluded to, well, I'm not allowed to speak about those, but you should either read or see them soon, hopefully. And yes, if you really don't like them, you have to promise just still communicate with me regardless. Yes, I'll stop here.
Thanks very much, Omar. Before turning over to questions and discussions, and I think we'll just go beyond the 4 o'clock timeline if we have to. I just wondered if Abdullah wants to say anything about his long friendship with Omar, if Abdullah's still here.
Yes. And with Dr. Muhammad Imadi, of course.
Yes, indeed. For those of you who don't know, Abdullah Al-Dardari is currently the UNDP representative in Kabul, but before that he has a long distinguished career in the World Bank, also the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for West Asia, and he was Deputy Prime Minister for the economy in Syria also. So, Abdullah, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Omar raises the moral dilemma we all faced when we were offered to join the government. I remember my father was almost on his deathbed when I told him I got an offer to become a Minister of Planning. And I was a young UNDP junior officer. I was not a very important person, professionally at least. And my father said, look at your uncle Muhammad. I mean, immediate reaction was, look at Muhammad Imadi. We called him Ammak Muhammad, your uncle Muhammad. Look how he survived and he succeeded and he made a name for himself and he helped his country. And so that's for you like a guiding light. And definitely Muhammad Imadi and Omar as well have been moral compass for someone like me who had to go through the tortuous waters of Syrian political economy in the years 2004, 2011. I have to say that even after all what we see in Syria today, I can't say I regret having worked for the government. I regret not being blunt enough while serving in government, not being blunt enough about the need for political reforms, not being blunt enough about the need for drastic and new social contract in Syria, and so on. But that's not, today is not about me, it's about Omar. And Omar is, from day one, our fathers knew each other a long time ago. My father was one of the 6 generals who were taught at the hand of Dr. Muhammad Imadi in 1969 at the Voroshelov Academy for Military Science in Moscow. And the teachers would come from Moscow, the Soviets would come from Moscow to do the military academic research and teaching, while Dr. Imadi was teaching them economics. And an NYU graduate was teaching Soviet academicians or graduates of a Soviet military academy economics. And that gives you a way, by the way, a way of how Hafez al-Assad was thinking about his rule in Syria later on, because he was already thinking that he would be president and he would be running the country and what type of economic management he will have. Omar, so our parents knew each other very well, respected each other very well. We were both pain in the neck of our parents for a while. He was giving hell to his father, when he was in high school, not knowing what exactly he wanted to do. I was doing exactly the same. And I actually, one day, my dad, who wanted me to be a doctor, I was telling him I want to be an economist. And he would say, he was complaining to Muhammad Imadi over lunch in Tunis at the Arabian. And then he told him, well, look, he told me, can you become like your uncle Muhammad? I said, yes, I can, if you allow me to do so. So anyway, it's a long story. Omar and I worked together at the United Nations in Damascus for a long time. Our paths crossed in many occasions. The work that we did together in UN ESQA later on that you referred to, the research on Syria at war, and then at the World Bank, where we and you, Ray, were with us on rebuild, the Building for Peace research we did at the bank, has been, all these occasions have been a learning experience scientifically, but also spiritually, working with Omar. His blog on my departure to Kabul, we started by saying, whenever people ask me where Syria is today, I say it's lost in Kabul, because if Abdullah decided to abandon the Syria file and go and work for Afghanistan, it means things are hopeless. But he kept hoping until the elections. I was more realistic, and I had lost hope before the elections, years before the elections. But he kept hoping. That shows you what a beautiful spirit Omar Imadi is. I am eager to read his book about the unauthorized biography, because I am personally touched by it. I am going through the moral dilemma of, what have you done? 7 years with Bashar al-Assad? What have you done? So, and how would you be judged? And who will judge you? And whether I'm going to have the Jackson, the lawyer in the Nuremberg trials, or I'll have Ruben, right? Ruben. Yes. Yes. What type of judgment I will have, and then later on there will be the real judgment, and God knows what will happen. I learn. I take my spiritual power from Omar. He is much more spiritual than I am, and so that, in addition, he is much more intellectual than I am. He can quote all these people, and I am a mere UN bureaucrat. I read UN reports and write UN reports and manage UN projects. So that's not very exciting, I have to say. So, and he is willing to take that adventure into a new life. And I have to say, at this age, I don't have that courage. So again, that's very inspiring. I will stay in touch with Omar, because for me, even though we don't see each other often, he is an essential part of my moral compass. So I will stay in touch with him. I will learn from him, and I'll ask him to guide me whenever the road is not very clear. And having served all these positions you mentioned, you don't become clearer, you become more confused at the end of 36 years of professional development work and political economy. So I can speak until tomorrow morning about Omar Imadi, but let me stop here and wish him best of luck. The Tawfiq Omar.
Thank you so much, Abdullah. Now, there must be so many people with questions.
Just add two words, Ray. I mean, Abdullah is, what does one say? I'm authentically, I'm not worthy of any of this, but these words say more about Abdullah than they do about me. And I will add just one thing. I was far less perplexed morally with Abdullah than I was with my father. And this is an important point. My father never opened up to me on a certain space, whereas Abdullah did. I can see Abdullah's mind in a way I can't see. My father, I think, is far more careful, far more reserved, far more silent, far more less willing about sharing how he really is seeing things. Whereas Abdullah, from day one, you can instantly, and everyone who met Abdullah knew what he is and the way he stood for. And I'll stop here. Thank you, Abdullah. Thank you, Habibi.
Thanks both. I hope they won't cut us off in 3 minutes, but on the presumption we'll be allowed to continue. Yes, Josefa, I see your hand up already. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for this wonderful afternoon. And first of all, I would say good luck to Omar and thank you for everything you've done. In the brief conversations we had in the past, I learned a lot from you. And I had a question to Tamara in terms of your research. Two questions. One question is about diasporic political communication, how effective it is. You know, how do you define, I mean, is it the diaspora and how do you define it? The latest article by Yassine Al-Haj-Saleh in Al-Jumhuriyya talked about the depopulated discourses. So there's he identifies three main narratives about Syria: geopolitical, culturalist, and civilizationist, and then the top-down anti-imperialist discourse that you sort of mentioned yourself as well. And they share all that they are depopulated, so there's no voice of Syrians. And so my question to you is, in your research, how do you see the diasporic political communication? How effective is that to, as you like, populate these dominant three discourses that Yassine is talking about in his latest article? So that's one question. The other question is about, have you looked at, so I'm based in Sweden and I'm in the board of the Syrian-Swedish Association, and we've done a lot of work. So networks are emerging on national level in host countries. Talking, you know, it's relating to this diasporic concept. And how do you see these political opportunity structures in host countries for Syrians? And have you looked at these emerging sort of national networks that are institutionalizing now as well and working together, of course, transnationally? So these are two.
I can take one or two more questions before asking people to respond if there's anybody. Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any hands up at this point, so go ahead, Tamara, and respond.
Thank you. Yeah. Sorry, I'm still muted. There you go. Don't know what I pressed something. Yes, some really good questions. And in fact, about your second point about the kind of international networks within different countries, that is actually something that I want to pursue, exploring further, because that isn't something, I know that there are these networks that exist, but how they function in these other countries, I'm not entirely sure. I have much more a better understanding of how things are in the UK, but even then, it is still quite fractured, and and I suppose going back to your second point, because they are sort of related. Your first question about the diaspora and the connection between is. A lot of the connections are based on maybe the type of work or the type of approach. So you have a lot of artists communicating with each other, a lot of, intellectuals on the other side, so there are, I suppose, pockets of these communication networks. But again, it's something that I do want to look into more. As I said, I focus specifically on Beirut and Istanbul because that's where people went initially and where things were happening at the time. But there is this significant move, especially into Europe, and these connections and these networks that are there now. Speaking about Yassine Al-Haj-Saleh, he's one of the main people in my work, and and I think what drove me a lot to do this is actually his call for the need for people's voices. I haven't actually read his most recent one, so I will have a look at that. So thanks for pointing that out. I hope I've answered some of the questions, at least vaguely.
Abdallah, did you have an intervention?
If nobody else, and if you allow me, I'd like to ask Dr. Al-Aoum, and just to indicate that this is a very, very important work. Syria, whoever will run Syria in the future is the group that has the narrative, the unifying narrative. And I have to say, the Syrian society inside Syria is so tired, is so broken. It cannot generate a unifying narrative. And the civil society, Syrian civil society outside Syria will do so and is capable of doing so. So I think this work is not just about the diaspora. It actually will be the work about the new Syria and how that narrative is being shaped. I just want to say that I am not sure that we can exclude the Islamists from that narrative. So it sounded as if, but not. It's not a question of where do I stand about on this. No, it's about how inclusive you want this narrative to be. So that's one point. I have a point to Dr. Arsalanian. Excellent, I mean, fascinating work. As an economist and as someone who specializes in political economy in practice, I find this really fascinating. Now, I'd like to point out in my personal opinion, two things. First, I don't buy the Haddad story of why the revolution started in Syria, but that's a different discussion that can take us for hours and hours. I don't buy that story. Nonetheless, you see, the problem with sanctions on Syria is that there is an asymmetry with the objective of the sanctions vis-a-vis the pain threshold of the Syrian regime. And the sanctions until today don't have a clear objective. It's all about changing the behavior, changing the calculus. It's not about bringing down the regime. And therefore the regime was, and the idea of incurring pain and pushing the regime to recalculate didn't work, because the pain threshold for the regime is so high. And they can live with all types, and they have adapted and benefited from that structure until now. They have benefited from that type of setup of structure of sanctions. So that asymmetry between what do we want to achieve really, I'm not, what is the objective of the sanctions, even the unannounced objectives of the sanctions, and compared to the type of sanctions and the regime's ability to deal with it. That asymmetry will keep the Syrian people stuck between a hard place and the rock, and they will be paying the price for those sanctions without incurring any political change on the scene. And we saw the elections that confirmed my conclusion. Thank you very much for the great opportunity, Raymond. I can stay for 5 more minutes, but I have a big meeting with the Deputy Secretary General on Afghanistan. And, I'm carrying that file as well. Which is, between Damascus, my sisters would tell me, have they lost their mind in the UN? They sent a Syrian to fix Afghanistan. I mean, you cannot fix your country. So what are you doing there? But thank you for the opportunity again. I'm really grateful for you and this wonderful team I met today. Thank you very much.
Stay if you can. I'll take Jasmine. You've had your hand up, so please go ahead.
Thanks, Ray. No, it's very short. I just wanted to say thank you to all of the presentations and the great work. I wanted to reiterate my huge thanks to Omar. Really, his sincerity and his commitment and his passion to the cause. I can completely see how Dr. Dardari's point about him being a moral compass, I mean, certainly that resonates, I think, with everyone that knows him, and he'll be a huge loss for the centre, but I hope we can all stay in touch with him. It really is a great figure to work with and learn from. I don't have any questions for Tamara. I think she's had enough of me probing her thesis, but I just wanted to point out there is a question from Josh Trainer in the chat, so it's quite a good one for Tamara. So that's it from me. Thanks.
Okay, I'll just pose a question for Ferdinand. Prediction's really hard, but you sort of suggested, Ferdinand, that there's a kind of struggle between two dynamics. One is the sanction busters. I suppose that's Russia and Iran and maybe some other of the regime's allies. And on the other hand, there's the objective, which Abdullah was skeptical will work, but the objective, of course, of the sanctions is if you create enough pain for the population, they will somehow revolt and bring the regime down, or the regime will implode. So who do you think's ahead? Is the sanction busters, or is it the states that are targeting the regime? At this point, how do you see it going, Ferdinand? So unless there's somebody else, I'll ask Ferdinand and then Tamara. Shall we do it that way? Go ahead, Ferdinand.
Yeah, hi, can we begin Tamara, because I'm walking right now. I just need to go to the train station. Once she finishes, I'm able to talk.
Okay.
Yeah, my schedule is a bit tight.
Can anyone see the chat? I can't find the chat for some reason.
Tamara, shall I read out Josh's
Yes,
question?
please. Yes, please, Jess.
So Josh says, Dr. Al-Am, you spoke about gradual bottom-up resistance. Would you say that the 2011 revolt did not symbolize the start of Syria's revolution, but instead the shift of an unstructured, growing social mobilization from new media to the streets? And he says, P.S. Good luck to Omar.
Okay, I'll go ahead and ask. No, I think social media, new media played a significant role in people being able to finally express themselves in a particular way. But as we've seen, you know, a lot of the initial uprising came from rural areas. So no, I think it played an important role in kind of mobilizing people, but I do think that it would have happened regardless. Yeah.
Oh, was there another question for you, Tamara?
Just in response to Abdullah about the unifying narrative, and I'm very aware of the exhaustion that people have, both obviously more so in Syria, but outside of it as well. And I do think that this sector of people are the people who are going to be eventually, I suppose, because we have to have hope, otherwise why do we do anything that we do, that they will be the people who will be able to rebuild and, you know, rebuild society in a certain way. And that's why I think the preservation of culture is so important as well there. And in terms of not excluding Islamists, and the point I make is who they're in opposition to is not Islamic people or necessarily even some of the Islamic groups. It's the extremists that they are opposed to, and I think that's something that is key in this, is that it's not about their their religious affiliation. It's more about their positionality. Yeah, because I think Islam is part of the culture. It's always going to be part of that narrative, and it has to be part of that narrative, definitely. Yeah, I think those are the things. That's me then.
Ferdinand, are you ready? If not, I've got another question from Ola. Yeah, go ahead, Ola.
Yeah, I can speak, but you need to bear the sound of the cars and.
Oh, okay.
No, I prefer Ola.
Okay, Ola, go ahead.
I don't have a question. I just want to thank Tamara and Ferdinand for such interesting research, and to say a big thank you to Omar, and that he will be terribly missed in the center. And thanks for the huge, efforts he did for the center, and to me personally, for everything, for editing my endless drafts, my blog, everything. Thank you, Omar. I will definitely stay in touch, and thank you so much. That's it.
Bravo.
Thank you, Ola, and thank you also, Jasmine, and thank you everyone really for all your kind words, most of which I'm not really very worthy of, but thank you nevertheless.
So Ferdinand, if you can hear us. Anybody else for tomorrow while we're waiting on Ferdinand? Or for Omar, by way of saying goodbye.
I just want to say,
I'm ready.
Oh, he's ready. I just want to say thank you, Omar, and you will certainly be missed.
Definitely.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you so much.
Go ahead, Ferdinand.
Okay, so welcome from Central Dundee. So Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so the question here is my framework about domestic mechanisms is based on countering the let's say simplistic macro correlation between pain and concession. So rather than viewing the whole set of how much damage has been done and relating it to concessions, basically we see how the damage or how does the cost related to sanctions affect the whole political economic situations, how different groups are affected, how the regime changes strategies, how does it co-opt, what method does it use for co-optation or repression. So in the case of Syria, we see that there are some reconfigured forms of maintaining the political economy. So the regime has, the control mechanisms are still in place. They have changed, but they're still there. So when we talk about the business class is still stratified. There is still the question of political positionality, where you are designed to have this sort of favoritism from the regime, and if you decide to leave, somebody else is willing to take place. Whereas populist class, there is still different forms of co-optation, where you have vast public sector, you have procurement of social services, procurement of essential foodstuff. So here we see that despite whatever costs they are, the strategies of co-optation have been maintained. So that's my argument here.
Okay.
What was Raymond? What was your question about the sanction busters?
Well, I just saw the battle over sanctions as a kind of struggle for power between the sanction busters that have a stake in keeping the Syrian regime viable, Iran and Russia, but also Assad and his other allies on the one hand. On the other hand, the sanctioning states, the United States in particular, that wants to make sure no reconstruction happens. And I think we are hoping that they'll be able to mount so much pressure on the regime that it has to concede, or that there could be rebellion. Abdullah doesn't expect rebellion nor concession on the part of the regime, because he says that they are able to adapt to the situation. And I thought I heard you agreeing with that.
So my argument of adaptation is looking how the transformation of political economy has taken place. So I don't disagree with them. I'm just putting it in a more different context.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Thank you.
So when we talk about so when we talk about senders and sanction busters, so there's like a tit for tat. So this group does that, the other group does a countermeasure, and you just have a war on the regional international level. But even looking at examining the internal dynamics of the sanction busters, so basically Russia and Iran, there is not an agreement between, let's say, the military departments and the finance departments on sanction busting. So the military bureaucracy wants to have more sanction busting. The finance has a veto. It doesn't want to send loans to the Syrian government. So again, it's not a complete, not comprehensive strategy, basically.
This is Russia you're talking about.
Russia as well as Iran. Like if we compare like the civil sanction busting compared with the military aid, then there's a high discrepancy between the billions that are claimed to be going to military support compared with the 1 billion per year, which goes off and off in terms of credit lines. So there's not a comprehensive or a competent strategy among the sanction busters.
Well, thank you. But one last question, because you raised it in your presentation. Did you suggest that the falling out between Bashar al-Assad and Rami Makhlouf is a sign of stress inside the regime that's inflicted by sanctions that could have longer-term repercussions?
Yeah, so my was more like to be investigated for the future, that we have a correlation between the Trump maximum pressure and this Asma versus Makhlouf. So the question here is that with the constraints of resources, the question is, do we have a principal agent where we have the principal is the Assad regime or the Assad himself, and the agent is Makhlouf as the banker of the system or of the regime? And the question here, that given this partial autonomy, has the constraint and the reduction of resources led to the necessity of reducing that autonomy or eliminating that autonomy? So it's just, this is more of an open question of how sanctions might have affected the elite contestation.
Thanks very much. Unless there's a last minute question, I think we'll bring this session to a close. And is there? Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us, but for the presenters in particular, I'd like to express our appreciation for your work and the very, very stimulating presentations and discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray.
Thank you. Welcome.
Take care.
See you guys later.
Bye.
So nice
Bye-bye.
to see everyone, by the way.